to debate on part 2 and Eugenie Sage's amendments set out clauses 7, 10, 12, 13, 18, 14, 16 and 19 set out on SOP number 87, and the tabled amendment inserting a new clause 11A. So just making it clear, we're debating what was agreed at the second reading and those amendments. Megan Boyce.
Chairman, it's my pleasure to take a call on part 2, and in particular I want to speak to clauses 7 and 10 of the bill, which cover off the content of both the synthesis and domain reports, the Clause 7 covering the synthesis reports and Clause 10 covering the domain reports. In addressing those clauses, as agreed to in Select Committee and reported back to the House, Mr Chairman, I also want to address the amendments that Eugenie Sage has put up in her supplementary order paper around they may be improved. If we turn our attention first of all, Mr Chairman, to Clause 7 of the bill, which is the contents of the synthesis reports, which asks that each synthesis report must describe in relation to the topics prescribed in regulations made under Section 18, and I'll come to Section 18, Mr Chairman, in a further contribution, all the matters, the state of New Zealand's environment, including biodiversity and ecosystems, the pressures that might be causing them. But Mr Speaker, why we are supporting the supplementary order paper that addresses Clause 7 of this legislation is that what we want to see to have meaningful environmental reporting that is of genuine benefit to the environment, that we have some way of analysing what is the cause of the state of the environment in which we are observing. That what we are seeing in terms of the legislation as it is before us in Clause 7, Mr Chairman, is that it is far too descriptive and not analytical enough. And what Eugenie Sage's amendment is set out is that she asks that what we do, that there is ways of analysing the content of those reports, and it being a far more productive and useful document when we have the synthesis reports come back to us. So that is a change, Mr Speaker. We have signalled our opposition to this bill from the very beginning. We have signalled our opposition to it at Select Committee, and we have in our contributions at this stages of the debate, Mr Speaker. But what we have also signalled is that if there could be some changes made to the legislation as it's reported back, that we would be willing to support it. And actually making sure that we had meaningful synthesis reports and meaningful domain reports, and the way in which the SOP sets out the amendments that actually would go some way to achieving it, would mean that Labor could support this legislation. Like the Greens, we perhaps would like to have seen some more far-reaching changes, but we think that the amendments that have been put up, and particularly in this part 2, are actually go a very far way into making this a bill that every member in this House could agree to. And I'm very interested to hear from the Minister and the Chair why it is that the government will not agree to the measures in part 2 that are being put up and supported by a number of parties in this House that would mean that this meant independent reporting. And in mentioning this, Mr Chairman, I am turning my attention now to Clause 18 of the legislation in part 2. What I want to know from the Minister is, why is there objection to putting in place protections to ensure that we don't just have a minister of whatever political hue making decisions about what is going to be reported on in our environmental reporting for political reasons? What we want to see is that there are decisions being made about what topics will be covered off are made for purely environmental reasons, that they are in the best interests of the environment and not in the best interests of someone's political agenda. And that is what the amendments that Eugenie Sage has put up in her supplementary order paper would achieve. that she has found a very good way in order to work around that, and that there are other bodies that many submitters came to Select Committee and they described other mechanisms that could be used to ensure that we did have independent environment reporting. And although they haven't found their way into the bill that we have before us, they have found their way into Eugenie Sage's order paper, into the amendments that she has put up, Mr Speaker, that several other bodies were put up as alternatives. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment was put up as one body that could make the decision, but the Parliamentary Commissioner herself told us that given that she had a commentary role in this bill, that wouldn't be appropriate. So, for that reason, the amendments, Mr Chairman, that we are looking at here today look at alternative mechanisms, and they look to the government statistician as one person, along with the Secretary of the Environment and the power of regulation making, and the way in which that can be used. Because, Mr Speaker, it is our firm belief that we have to have the political distance in the interests of the environment to be in place. Because, Mr Speaker, the other clause I want to turn my attention to now is the role of the Commissioner, which I've alluded to in my discussion of clause in a previous clause. The role of the Commissioner is a very specific function under this legislation, as covered off in clause 17. It's in accordance with the function and powers under the Environment Act of 1986. The Commissioner may, at his or her discretion, report on an environmental report and processes that produced it. The matters that the Commissioner may report under subsection 1 include, but are not limited to, analysing environmental reports, identifying trends, discussing the implication of environmental report findings, and recommending responses to environmental report findings. These are all incredibly important functions, and we've already seen the Commissioner produce one report that is a prelude to what is going to be produced under clause 17 of this legislation in terms of the air quality domain report that was produced earlier this year, and gave a bit of a taste to the public of the worth and the value of the reporting that we could potentially see under this. What we had from the Commissioner was a very sound consideration of the science, particularly in regard to particulate levels and what it is that we should be measuring when we are considering air quality in New Zealand. Should we be looking at the kind of particulate that we have previously, that traditionally has been of concern in New Zealand in P10s, or should we go down to a smaller level and measure a different kind of particulate? And Mr Speaker, it is our great desire that we would be able to support legislation that is going to produce such sound information on the state of our environment, such as this. Mr Speaker, it is with sadness that Labor isn't able to support this legislation, that we are one of the very few countries in the OECD that doesn't have an environmental reporting framework, and to hear the contribution from the Chair of the Select Committee, who did a very fine job in chairing that Select Committee, to say that we're clutching at straws, echoing the words of the Minister who was in the chair last night, is simply not true. We worked hard and we worked constructively at Select Committee to try and ensure that we could genuinely have independent environmental reporting in this country. That is not some straw. The fact that you don't have political decision making for political purposes around how it is we are going to have a safeguard around our environment is not what I call a straw. And perhaps the Minister and the Chair of the Select Committee's attitude to that gets to the very heart of the problem, and why it is that we have a deficit in this legislation that we're here debating tonight, because they don't see a problem with having political interference and a political oversight in how it is that we measure the state of our environment. But for us in Labor and on this side of the House, that is not just a straw in the wind. That is a fundamental that has to be there in any piece of legislation that purports to be about reporting on the state of our environment. It is lacking here, and I will cover off some other things that are lacking in this legislation and further contributions in this part, Mr Chairman. But for this, I want to hear from the Minister. I'd like to hear the Minister on his feet and giving us an explanation as to why it is that we cannot put in place the mechanisms that are being put up in a supplementary order paper that would give us independence. What is it that is so frightening about having a level of independence in the decision making around what it is that we report on? This is something that has to be addressed in the course of this debate. We cannot just have a minister who sits there and refuses to address such a fundamental question as that. We are not asking for the earth, Mr. Chairman. We are asking for a basic tenet of any robust and good environmental reporting system, and that is independence from political interference. That is not too much to ask. And until we can see that in this legislation, we cannot support it. But Mr. Chairman, if members of the opposition find it in the course of this debate that Mr. Chairman,